What's going on, guys? Welcome to another video. This time we're going to be doing something a little different. I've always wanted to do a tier list, which is what we're doing today. However, I wanted to make sure that I was actually knowledgeable of what I was talking about, so that's why I waited so long. I know there's a ton of tier lists out there right now, and eventually I do want to do one about everything, just to show my two-piece. Plus, they're fun, and I like talking about the game. Without further ado, this particular tier list is going to be mainly about the classes. And I want to preface this by saying that I don't think any class is bad, but I do think there is still a hierarchy to these things. Now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, Alchemist is starting off. I hate starting off with Alchemist because I'm not a fan of Alchemist. I think it has some pretty neat things it can do, and a lot of their vials are pretty strong. But overall, um, I don't think it's A tier. I guess I'll put it at C for now, if I think of something later. Because, like, the issue with Alchemist is I'm doing this from a perspective of both what it can do for its teammates and what it can do by itself. And if I'm comparing it to what it can do for its teammates, it's got some pretty cool buffs, but if you want to be support, then Medic is probably better. Yeah, but, like, actually, Frenzy Dust is really nice. Hmm. The Alchemist just doesn't bring a whole lot outside of Frenzy Dust and its support. Because, like, its first ability is the defense, which is strictly. It stops you from being one shot, which is good, unless you have, like, a whole bunch of damage taken all at once. It's a defense buff, which, in my opinion, isn't super useful. And also the fact that you've got to throw the vial and you have to be in it when Medic can just put it, like, he's got the AoE abilities that are just automatically happen. There is the well, we have to target the well, but I think I'm gonna leave it at C. It has a lot of things it can do, but other than Frenzy Dust, which is purely unique to him, a lot of it is just preventing damage or resing allies, which other classes can just do better. So we're gonna leave it at C for now. Moving on to Archon. Hmm. So this is gonna be a bit controversial. Uh, I don't like Archon. Spent so much effort getting Archon, and I'm just not a fan of it. It relies more on mod power and all that sort of stuff. And I just, other than like Hellstorm, there's not really a mod that I like using all that much. I'm also biased with the fact that I like gun builds more than anything else. I've been enjoying Engineer a lot recently, but gun builds is where I'm at. So when it comes to dealing damage outside of guns, I usually just use mods to support the gun build. So I'll put it at B. Do I put it at C2? It just doesn't do a lot. Its first two abilities are really, really, really bad. The only ability it has that's actually good is its Archon form, and then while you're in it, you can't even use mods. So it's like a combination of wanting to use skills and mods, but it doesn't give you any skill damage, it's just mod damage. I don't know. It's a very underwhelming class, honestly. It just doesn't deal a whole lot of damage. It's trying to be too many things at once, I guess. It's just not fun for me. Moving on to Challenger. Challenger is going to be an A tier. Easy A tier. It's a very strong class. Very hard to kill. A lot of survivability. All of their skills are good. They're all for different builds, but they're all very good. The Stomp is really good AoE and damage and staggering. Very good for crowds in the overworld. Not very good for bosses, but they each have their own niche. Juggernaut is a very, very fun one. Juggernaut can be it's so useful for your melee builds and all that sort of stuff. And in fact, on my video, I used Juggernaut, and it winds up being so crazy, all the things you can do, because you can stack rocket fuel, You can stack um, the Juggernaut, and you can stack. There's another one, I think. The point is, you can stack a whole bunch of melee attack speed bonuses and just go crazy with it. And it's funny too because the more attack speed you have, the more you can dodge at the same time because it finishes your animation for your attack faster, which leaves you less vulnerable to being stuck in an animation, which is really strong. On top of the fact that a challenger also has, I think, the highest damage possible for a skill increase with his rampage going from 25 and then when you fully stack it, it becomes 50, which is crazy and I'm pretty sure is instrumental to being some of the highest damage numbers you can get. There's a challenger hunter build out there that's on the subreddit that I saw, and it was doing over 10k, and it's ridiculous. Kind of hard to pull off. I will say that Rampage is a skill that isn't always going to do what you want it to do. It's kind of hard to do what it wants outside of massive damage or killing a lot of ads, which, I mean, obviously that's what it's supposed to be used for. But it's just hard to proc sometimes. And then when you do proc it, you have that second of standing still, which can sometimes be bad. You can't take damage while you're standing still, but if you get hit immediately after the immunity ends, then you're in for a bit of trouble. But overall, Challenger is a very, very strong class. A lot of damage, a lot of survivability. The only issue it really has is its range and the fact that you want to get so close to your enemies, which can sometimes be bad, but they're bulky enough to really not be that big of a problem. Moving on to Engineer. Engineer is Engineer. Oh, man. Ah, originally I would put him at B, but I've been playing a lot of Engineer, and he's a lot of fun. Which makes me want to put him at A, but I don't think he's A material. I wouldn't put him on par with Challenger. I'm gonna put him at B. I want to put him A. I'll put him high B. Let's call it high B. Engineer is a lot of fun, and its whole gimmick is that he uses his skills for most of his damage, and in late game, you pretty much never have to put down your heavy weapons. You can just use your overcharge, use your heavy weapon, use all of your ammo, use a crystal, pick up your heavy weapon again, use the ammo, overcharge again, and just use that continuous loop for endless minigunnage or whatever weapon you're using, because he's also got a flamethrower and an impact cannon. They're all crazy, they're all really good. And overall, I think it's very, very strong. The thing is, you're also probably one of the most vulnerable classes, just because you have to perfect dodge if you've got your gun out. You don't have any sort of leeway or any sort of way of dodging stuff. You have to perfect dodge or you're gonna get hit by attacks. Which is a very high skill, like, it's a high risk, high reward gameplay, because I also think that the damage that the engineer outputs has the potential to be just one of the highest DPSs out there. Like a late game full build engineer is nuts. On top of the fact that they're also very, very hard to kill as well, so when you do get hit, it doesn't hurt all that much. But I still think it's fairly high risk just because of how often you will get hit if you aren't able to perfect dodge consistently, which means that you've got to learn the game in order to actually take advantage of the power of engineer completely. Now, most of the time, I'm pretty sure you just run the laser cannon. That's overall the best in my opinion. The other two are good for really big hordes. He's got a flamethrower, which is more for horde killing than boss killing, but that winds up not being too important to me. This game's all about killing bosses, so you would want the higher damage gun to get the bosses make the bosses easier, basically. And the other one is like an impact cannon, which is a really hard to explain. It's just a big railgun, I guess. Yeah, a railgun's a good way of describing it. Not to mention, you could also set these turrets down and they'll act autonomously. They're less effective this way, but they're good cover. So the engineer just has a lot of options, a lot of damage. If you want to take full advantage of what he can do, it's going to be pretty skill intensive, but overall a very strong and very fun class. Moving on to Explorer. Um, this isn't really fair. I don't have anything to say about Explorer. It's not a combat focused class. Explorer's whole gimmick is that he's able to find the loot. If you've got him equipped it as a secondary class, it can be pretty good too. Actually, do you need it as a primary class for Lucky to activate? I don't remember. I actually don't use Explorer a lot. Ah, oh, crap. I wanted to be prepared for this, and now I can't even remember. Basically, the whole thing with Explorer is that they're supposed to be really good at finding stuff, but they're really bad in combat. They have one of the lowest damages, I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Their abilities also just aren't very useful. His first one's pretty good, his second one's not good, and his third one's not combat at all. So his first one is where he applies a buff to him and his allies where stamina generation is increased by like 80% and stamina is the other way around, increased by 20% and stamina cost is reduced by 80%. Basically infinite stamina. And that is pretty useful. Unfortunately, I don't know, unless you're going a completely support-oriented build, I don't know how you would really take advantage of that too much. You could probably go like Alchemist, Explorer, and be Frenzy Dust with the stamina reduction. That'd be not bad. But it's not, it's just not good. It's not great. It's not a combat-oriented class, which is why I said it wasn't fair. The second ability has more potential to be damaged, but winds up also being fairly useless because you dig up a spot and it applies a random buff, anything from healing to damage reduction to damage. Issue is it's not a permanent area. It's very, very brief, and it's also you have to be standing in it, and you just can't stand still in Remnant 2. You just can't. So whenever a static buff is placed on the ground, you can pick it up for whatever duration is, but you probably won't be going back to it unless you get really lucky. So it's like a one-time thing. Plus, you can't ever use this ability in combat. You've got to use it before combat. Otherwise, you're just going to get hit, because it's a very long animation to do the shovel, because it's called Gravedigger. And then finally, the third one is just Treasure Hunter, I believe it's called, where the only thing it does is it spots treasure. It shows you the location of any nearby collectibles. That's all it does. So, as I said, it's not very fair. I'm going to put it at D as more of a not to be considered for this sort of thing. Overall, I find Explorer to be not very interesting or fun. On top of the fact that anything you might need it for, you can already just find or do. So it just winds up not being very good in any scenario. But regardless, we move on to Gunslinger. Ooh, I'm biased for this baby. I'm gonna put Gunslinger at A. Gunslinger is very strong in my opinion. I already think gun builds are the best way to play this game, obviously. There's a lot of little things you can do. There's more mod-oriented and more skill-oriented sort of stuff. There's even companions you can rely heavily on. But all of it always comes back to your primary weapon being a considerable portion of your damage. So whenever a class instead leans more heavily into the fact that you have a gun and making that gun better, is just going to be stronger. I talked about it with Challenger. Challenger is one of the best builds for damage, raw damage. And I think one of the top three is going to also wind up being Gunslinger. Gunslinger is less damage. It's still a lot of damage, but it's less damage in turn for a lot of reload speed. so the effective DPS might wind up being higher depending on what gun you use. But I've always been a big fan of Gunslinger because it's always its early game is really strong. Honestly, your first couple levels, that first ability has that one-shot pistol is very very good, and instantly reloading your weapon for free is also very very strong. With a gunslinger, you wind up never really running out of ammo, and late game builds, you're reloading very fast, especially with skills like Bulletstorm. Now, in my opinion, Bulletstorm and I can't remember the name of the skill. The one shot. They're both very very strong skills. The Sidewinder ability winds up taking a bit of a backseat. It's not necessarily bad. It's just that the way you play Gunslinger and the way that skill wants to be used is completely different. Like, I find myself to be drawn towards either the shotguns or the full autos rather than the one shots when it comes to Gunslinger. Although I suppose you could use the Spore Bloom in some regards. Eh. Regardless, Sidewinder is ability that I find to be pretty weak, but the early game ability of the one shot or the spread shot, depending on what you do with it, I should probably look up the name so I can remember what it's called. It's still pretty strong, and it's very, very useful. And Bulletstorm winds up being some of my favorite builds that involve Bulletstorm. It's a very, very fun skill where you just basically uber buff yourself. You shoot faster, you reload faster, and whenever you kill something, you fully reload your weapon automatically. Very, very fun. Typically, if you're using this skill, then you also want Gunslinger to be your secondary, not your primary. But it gets super complicated, and all the builds. If we talked about all the different things and all the different combinations, we would be here for hours. So I won't get too deep into that just yet. But regardless, it's just a ton of damage, and it's a very fun class, and also leans into probably the meta build in my opinion. So overall, a very very strong, very very easy A in my opinion. And yeah, we can move on. The handler. Oh man, and handler is also very, very useful. I'm gonna put this in A as well. Handler has a lot going for it. That's A. I'm gonna do A for now. Handler is very, very, very versatile. It's a safe class, it's got good damage, it's got good support, and it's very, very versatile. So Handler has a companion that helps him out in combat, and this dog can do anything from hold aggro to heal your allies to give yourself more damage to reviving your allies or yourself. On top of the handler's base stats of increasing skill damage and auto damage, it's very, 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 very strong. And I find myself really enjoying myself whenever I play handler too. I mean, you got the bestest boy on your side. How could you not be happy? He's such a good boy. Even late game, handler winds up being very strong. The taunt winds up being less useful the stronger you get, but in the overworld, whenever you're being swarmed in a pinch, the taunt is so useful. And the self-res is very, very good of being a second life, similar to the way Challenger is. Basically, Handler is just a less damage-intensive Challenger in terms of safety, but in turn, you have a whole bunch of buffs you can give to yourself or your team. It's a very high utility, and there's really no shortage of uses. On top of the fact that it's really hard for your dog to even die, and when it does, you can just use your own heart, your dragon heart, and it will revive the dog. So, honestly, there's not very many weak points for Handler, other than the fact that their mod usage is very, very bad. But I mean, mods aren't really too important Unless you're doing something like Archon, which we've already talked about. I'm not the biggest fan of it. You can just use that as more support or more damage for yourself. And honestly, there's not too many weaknesses to Handler. You're not the tankiest, but you're also not very, very vulnerable. You're not the highest damage, but you're also not the lowest. And overall, you're just a you, if you have a challenger on your team or a handler on your team, it's always going to be good. Now we move on to Hunter. Oh boy. Hunter is also one of my favorite classes. Hunter is insane. It's an easy S tier. I think it's going to be my only S tier too. Now, the thing with Hunter is that it doesn't have any weaknesses other than being easy to kill. It has so much damage. It's got a lot of utility. It's got a lot of range. It just does so much stuff. Now, a byproduct of also having really good range means that you don't have to get so close to your enemies, and that means you're also therefore safer as well. So you're easy to kill, but you're never typically in a position where you're gonna get hurt. So it winds up being this weird thing where because you have so much damage and so much range, most of stuff is going to die before it even gets to you. And if you pair this with any other high damage class like Gunslinger or Challenger, it winds up just being insane. On top of the fact that your three skills are just ridiculous, and crit in Remnant 2 is very, 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 very simple, and it always winds up being very important for your late game builds. Whether that be skill crit or ability crit or just normal crit, Hunter is always going to be very, very good in that regard because on top of applying crit buffs to yourself, you also can apply a debuff to the enemy, which increases their crit chance against them. And this works for your entire team. Hunter's Mark is one of the best abilities, honestly. It's very easy to use and very, very strong. On top of the fact that in this game it's even stronger considering it increases your damage by 15%? Your ranged and melee damage by 15%. Which in Remnant 1 it didn't do that. It just increased your crit against enemies by 15%. So on top of increasing your crit by 15% in this game, it also increases your damage by 15%. And you compare that with all sorts of other stuff and the fact that late game, your characters have just base 10% crit, and then say you get another thing which increases your crit chance by 10%, plus your gun has a crit chance by itself, and then you can use like corrosive rounds or something like that, and then there's also it's crazy. There are so many different ways to guarantee your crits with Hunter that it winds up just being so stupid strong. And you can pair Hunter with anything and it would be good. It doesn't matter what you pair it with, Hunter is just that strong. And I haven't even begun to talk about their other skills. I think Hunter's Mark is the best, but Hunter's Focus is the highest potential damage. Now, the reason I don't really talk, I'm not really thinking that Hunter's Focus is all that great, is because it's very, very hard to use in a single player experience, which is normally how I play. I play single player a lot more than I play multiplayer. In multiplayer, you probably have a lot easier time using focus, but it just, every time you do something besides aim down sights, you've got to re-wait for that buff again. And if you're the one being targeted, which sometimes, or actually a lot of the time, you're probably going to be the one being targeted because of how much your damage you're dealing as this class, it winds up being hard to consistently utilize the skill. But when you do get to use it properly, it's insane, because on top of giving you 25% increase in damage, it also gives you 10% crit on top of marking enemies that you're aiming at, which means that this skill alone gives you 25% crit, and that's just crazy. And then there's also the Hunter's Shroud, I think, which is a very fun ability. I think it's his weakest ability, but it's very, very fun. using things like bows and arrows and sniper rifles with this ability is very, very fun, and it's honestly really, really strong too. It's not weak by any regard, it's just it's the most niche, because it's not really gonna be up to par with consistent damage. Overall, I think damage in Remnant 2 has leaned more towards consistent and shotguns more than it has towards the one-shot weapons. Not that they're bad, but there's just a lot more opportunities to deal a ton of damage with those full auto weapons. There's a lot easier ways to take advantage of them. So overall, the burst playstyle, while still having a lot of value, especially since one of the best or highest damage builds in the game is a burst build, it just winds up being harder to utilize the skill. Once again, when you are able to utilize the skill to its full extent, it's very, very strong. Everything Hunter does is strong. It's just, once again, not as easy or as simple, and it takes a lot of different gear to actually utilize as well. So, it winds up being the weakest of the skills. But overall, Hunter is a nuts class. You can never go wrong. And the only reason you're not using Hunter right now is because you wanted to play around with something else. Hunter is ridiculous, and that's kind of the end of it. Moving on to Invader. But put it at B. Invader is kind of weird. There's a lot of really kind of funky. It's a kind of complicated class. Very, very confusing at times. Typically, if I'm ever using this class, I just keep it very simple. Its first ability is really, really strong. Its second ability is decent, and its third ability is okay. Its first ability is for 60 seconds, you apply to a buff to yourself where if you get hit, you automatically dodge that attack. And overall, I think it's a very, very strong skill. And I think it's also pretty fun to utilize in terms of using combos like for melee builds, Challenger and Invader, or Invader Handler, or just something like that. Something that makes it to where it negates the risk of a class. Because that's what Invader is. It negates the risk of a lot of things in terms of how dangerous it is to play. Because it's just a very safe class. And it's also very, very mobile because its second skill, Black Hole, or is it Black Hole? It's Wormhole. It's called Wormhole, not Black Hole. Wormhole. It's very, very good for mobility. On top of the fact that it applies a buff that increases the next damage you deal by 200%. So you can utilize this with your burst builds and get a lot of value out of them. So there's the idea of combining it with Hunter, because you can combine Hunter with everything, and use Prowl with a Black Hole or a Wormhole to get a lot of damage for your one shot. And that's a good way of getting a lot of value. But overall, I think it's better at just being a supporting class solely because, once again, it's very good at negating the risk of playing classes. If you're scared of taking damage, you can play Invader, and it will make your life a whole lot easier. That's its primary strength, in my opinion. Moving on to Medic. Put it at B as well. Medic is a very interesting class in Remnant 2. Healing has always been pretty strong, and if you don't get one shot, Medic is going to keep you full health pretty much the entire time. And even if you do go down, Medic is also really good at reviving you, but there's a lot of risks to that, and I would rather just use a handler or some sort of self-revive perk. Regardless, Medic's not the damage, obviously. Medic is a medic. They're all about healing you and making sure the team is topped up. Now, I'm putting Medic at B tier because I know their potential is really high. However, I will state that I haven't really seen Medic do anything insane. Their potential is good. I haven't seen it happen yet. I think medic is strong, and I just don't think there is a whole lot of opportunities to show off this strength. Supporting via purely healing is kind of difficult to take advantage of because if you don't take damage, then what's the point of your class existing? But if you get one shot, then other classes are better at rezzing you. So pairing medic with bulkier classes that don't get one shot is your best way of playing. But then in that scenario, you would also want something like handler or just something that gives you that extra damage that you need to just win the fight faster, or just to get the heat off you, or just a free res. But I still think Medic is stronger than Alchemist in that regard because you can get that res ability and it will res the entire team. You don't have to throw it anywhere. All these abilities just activate automatically. And it's a lot less riskier to use their abilities because with Alchemist you've got to stop what you're doing, pull out your vial, aim it, throw it, or if you're just gonna toss it on yourself, you can do that too. But in that term, nobody but you is getting that buff. With Medic, other than the healing well, you can just press a button and your entire team gets a shield, or your entire team gets a heal and a res, and it's that simple and that strong. I also think that Medic is probably really, really safe in terms of how easy they are to kill. It's very, very difficult to kill a bulky medic because they've always got some healing going on top with their perks, triage, letting them heal really, really fast. As I said, if you don't get one shot, you're probably at full health with a medic on your team. Another reason why medic is kind of hard for me to mess with is just because my playstyle doesn't really support a medic. I love glass cannon. So I'm either dealing tons of damage and not getting hit at all, or I'm dead. So that also just makes it to where medic can't really help me in that regard. It's a playstyle issue, not a class issue. But regardless, we are able to move on to our final class, Summoner. I want to put Summoner at A. I don't know if I can. The Summoner is, I would say, is weaker than Handler. Is it stronger than Engineer is really my question, because Engineer's at the top. Oh boy. It's taking some thinking. Is it stronger than Engineer? No, I don't think it is. I think it's stronger than Invader, so I'll put it here. So, Summoner is interesting because they get a little bit of everything, which means that they're not really bad at anything, especially if you combo them with something and you can primarily lean into that while also having a little bit of something else. Now, Summoner is very, very straightforward. You summon things and then you can sacrifice them for a buff. While things are summoned, you get increased skill and mod damage. When you sacrifice something, you get increased ranged and melee damage. So there's this dynamic where you can use your summons to give yourself consistent damage, and then when you want to kill something really fast, you can sacrifice for a huge burst of damage. And it's a very, very fun sort of mechanic. Especially since you have all sorts of different summons, anything from your stupid little tumbleweeds that are annoying as crap from Isha to ranged ads, which everyone winds up using because the ranged ads are the best in terms of damage and they don't die. So you're always able to sacrifice them at a moment's notice for your bonus. And then there's also the Big Reaver, which is very, very impressive and very, very cool, but also the least practical, unfortunately. Overall, it's a very, very good class, but I think it's just too minor in its bonuses to really bump it up over other things. Because it's trying to do too much. You either get mod and skill damage, or you get ranged and melee damage. You don't get both, and it doesn't increase one of the bonuses, it swaps out the bonus. So it winds up being more wanting to lean towards your your melee, and your range damage needs to be pretty high because that's your burst, and you want your burst to be strong because that's when you sacrifice, and you only have a very short window to take advantage of that. On top of the fact that I think this class is decently safe, your summons can hold aggro, but it's not as good as the handler, and it's also not as consistent. On top of the fact that you have Regenerator as a perk, which means that you're always regaining health, which means if you're not one shot, then you're doing pretty good. But once again, it's a bit of a playstyle desync, because I just don't like summoning as a playstyle. When I was leveling these classes, it was a lot of fun to combo. It was a lot of fun to combo Handler and Summoner together, because it did that thing where I had always had a skill bonus and a lot of ranged damage, and then when I needed to use my burst, it just doubled down on those bonuses. So I feel like Summoner takes a lot from being comboed with the appropriate classes in order to really shine. Just like most of these ones in B class all take a secondary thing to really take advantage of what they can do. But overall, I think Summoner is a very mid-tier class and can do a lot of really cool things. It's just it winds up being a little too slow, and it winds up being a little too much of small buffs towards everything, so it can't really shine in any particular regard. But other than that, I think I'm pretty happy with this tier list. I'm just trying to do some any last minute thinking, because like I still feel bad about putting Archon in C because it was such a huge thing. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just trying to think, because like the shield isn't useful. The Chaos Gate ability can be decent, but it's such a small area. It's annoying to be in because it messes up your screen. It increases the damage you take. I don't think I can put anything. I can't really justify putting it because it's not better. It's also tempted to swap Alchemist and Medic. The more I talked about it, the more I realized that Alchemist is just more versatile. They're more difficult to use, but they're more versatile. I think I'm just going to leave this here. I think this is about where I would put everything. Overall, I think the only thing that really needs to be notified is that Explorer is not a combat class. If you're using Explorer, it's because you're trying to find something, not because you're trying to kill something. So, other than that, everything else is usable. Like, just because Alchemist and our Archon are in C tier doesn't mean you can't take advantage of what they can do. They can still do pretty cool things. Especially, Archon is a very, very flashy class and is very, very fun. And again, I don't like taking advantage of mods. I like using mods as a support. And even when I was using an Archon build, it was more it just wasn't what I wanted it to be. And the only time you're really taking advantage of Archon is if you're using high damage mods. There's only like 2 or 3 in the game, and everyone just uses Hellstorm. But yeah, just because this list has all these rankings doesn't mean anything. It's just my perspective of how these classes fit in regards to being compared to each other. Just because I think Hunter is the best class in the game doesn't mean that you can't use Archon to do some crazy stuff. Just because Challenger does the most damage in terms of raw damage output doesn't mean you can't have fun with Engineer. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you guys agreed with this tier list or not. Let me know what your opinions are on it. Anything that you want to share, I'm open to anything. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will see you guys in the next one. Adios, boys.